The winter storm had been raging for 3 days when Detective Mark Sullivan received the missing person report. Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old hiking enthusiast, had vanished during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. Her family hadn't heard from her in 4 days, and, with temperatures dropping to dangerous levels, time was running out. Mark had seen cases like this before. Most missing hikers were found within 48 hours, either safe at a ranger station or sadly, not safe at all. But, something about Sarah's disappearance felt different. She was experienced, well-prepared, and had left a detailed trail plan with her roommate. The kind of person who didn't just vanish without a trace. The search and rescue teams had been combing the area for 2 days with no luck. Helicopters couldn't fly in the harsh weather, and ground teams were limited by the deep snow and freezing winds. Mark decided to join the search himself, something he rarely did for missing person cases. But his gut told him this was important. On the 3rd day of searching, Mark found himself separated from the main search party. He had been following what looked like disturbed snow patterns when the weather suddenly worsened. Visibility dropped to nearly zero, and he realized he was lost. His radio crackled with static, but no clear communication could get through. The GPS on his phone showed he was miles from where he thought he was. As darkness began to fall, Mark spotted something through the swirling snow. It looked like a structure, barely visible among the trees. Fighting against the wind, he made his way toward what turned out to be an old hunting cabin, partially hidden by overgrown pine branches and years of neglect. The wooden structure was weathered but appeared solid enough to provide shelter from the storm. Mark approached the cabin carefully, his police training kicking in. Something felt off about the place. There were recent footprints in the snow around the building, partially filled but still visible. Someone had been here recently. The front door was slightly ajar, moving gently in the wind with a soft creaking sound that sent chills down his spine. He called out, announcing himself as police, but received no response except the echo of his own voice and the howling wind. Drawing his flashlight, Mark pushed open the door and stepped inside. The beam of light revealed a space that had clearly been lived in recently. There were food wrappers on a makeshift table, a sleeping bag spread out on an old cot, and, most importantly, a small campfire that was still smoldering in the stone fireplace. That's when he saw her. In the corner of the cabin, partially hidden behind an overturned chair, lay a young woman. Mark's heart raced as he recognized her from the missing person photos. It was Sarah Chen. She was unconscious, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Her hiking clothes were torn, and there were visible injuries on her arms and legs. But she was alive. Mark immediately checked her pulse and breathing. She was hypothermic but stable. He radioed for emergency medical assistance, though he wasn't sure if his transmission would get through in the storm. Sarah's eyes fluttered open as he covered her with his own jacket, adding it to her sleeping bag for extra warmth. "Help," she whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were filled with fear, and she seemed to be looking past Mark toward the door. "He's coming back." Mark felt his blood run cold. "Who's coming back?" "Sarah, you're safe now. I'm Detective Sullivan. Who did this to you?" But, before Sarah could answer, they both heard it. Footsteps crunching through the snow outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps that were getting closer. Mark quickly turned off his flashlight and drew his weapon, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. The footsteps stopped right outside, and, for a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then, the door began to open slowly, and Mark realized that finding Sarah was only the beginning of something much more dangerous. The cabin had seemed like a refuge, but it was about to become a trap. Someone else knew about this place, someone who had been keeping Sarah here against her will. And now that person was coming back. The door creaked fully open, and a large figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against the snowy night. Mark could see the outline of something in the person's hand, but couldn't make out what it was in the darkness. His finger tightened on the trigger of his service weapon as he prepared for whatever was about to happen next. "Step into the light and keep your hands where I can see them," Mark called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The figure paused but didn't comply. Instead, Mark heard a low chuckle that made his skin crawl. I wondered when someone would finally come looking for her, the voice said. It was a man's voice, rough and cold. But I didn't expect it to be just one person. That was careless. Mark's mind raced as he tried to assess the situation. Sarah was in no condition to move quickly, and the storm outside made escape nearly impossible. He was outnumbered and in unfamiliar territory, with limited communication to the outside world. But he had training, experience, and, most importantly, a determination to get Sarah out of there safely. The standoff continued for several tense moments, with neither Mark nor the stranger making a move. In that silence, Mark could hear Sarah's labored breathing behind him and the wind continuing to howl outside. He knew that whatever happened next would determine whether they both made it out of that cabin alive, or whether the mountain would claim 2 more victims in the endless winter night. The stranger took another step into the cabin, and Mark could finally see him more clearly. He was a tall man, probably in his 40s, with long greasy hair and clothes that looked like he had been living in the wilderness for months. What Mark noticed most was the hunting knife in the man's right hand, its blade reflecting the dim light from the dying fire. My name is Detective Mark Sullivan, Mark said, keeping his weapon trained on the intruder. I'm here to help Sarah. Put down the knife and we can talk about this. The man laughed again, a sound that was more disturbing than threatening. Talk? There's nothing to talk about, Detective. Sarah and I have been having a very pleasant conversation for the past few days. Haven't we, sweetheart? Behind Mark, Sarah whimpered softly. He could feel her trembling, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. How long has she been here? Mark asked, though he was afraid of the answer. For days now, the stranger said casually, as if discussing the weather. I found her wandering around after she got lost in the storm. Brought her here to keep her safe and warm. I've been taking very good care of her. Mark's jaw clenched as he realized what that probably meant. What's your name? Names don't matter up here, Detective. Up here, only survival matters. And, right now, you're threatening my survival. The man suddenly lunged forward with the knife, and Mark had no choice but to react. He fired a warning shot into the wooden wall, the sound echoing loudly in the small space. The stranger stopped immediately, his eyes going wide with surprise. The next one won't be a warning, Mark said firmly. Drop the knife. Now. For a moment, it looked like the man might comply. His hand began to lower, and Mark felt a surge of relief. But, then, the stranger smiled again and shook his head. You know, Detective, I've been alone up here for a long time. A very long time. And I've learned something important about survival. Sometimes you have to make hard choices. Sometimes you have to do things that city folks like you wouldn't understand. What are you talking about? Mark asked, though he was beginning to get a terrible feeling about where this was heading. I'm talking about the fact that this cabin isn't big enough for 3 people. And I'm talking about the fact that there's another storm coming tonight that's going to be worse than the last one. And I'm talking about the fact that there's only enough food here for 2 people for maybe another week. Mark felt his blood run cold. You're suggesting that one of us has to die? I'm not suggesting anything, Detective. I'm telling you how it is. This is my cabin, this is my mountain, and these are my rules. The strong survive, and the weak don't. It's that simple. The man began to circle slowly around the small cabin, keeping the knife ready and his eyes fixed on Mark. Mark tracked him with his weapon, but the confined space made things dangerous. Any shot he fired risked hitting Sarah or ricocheting off the walls. Tell me about yourself, Mark said, trying to buy time and learn more about his opponent. How long have you been living up here? 3 years, the man replied. Ever since my life down in the world went to hell. Up here, things make sense. Up here, there are no lies, no pretending, no false promises. Just truth. As the man talked, Mark noticed something important. There were other items in the cabin that he hadn't seen before. Personal belongings that didn't look like they belonged to either Sarah or this mountain man. A woman's purse in one corner. A man's wallet on a shelf. A collection of driver's licenses scattered on the table. Mark's heart sank as he realized the horrible truth. Sarah wasn't this man's first victim. The cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a trap. And they had walked right into it. "How many people have you brought here?" Mark asked, his voice barely concealing his disgust. The stranger's smile widened. "Enough to learn what works and what doesn't. Enough to perfect my methods. You see, detective, people get lost up here all the time. Hikers, campers, hunters. The mountain is dangerous, and sometimes people just disappear. No one asks too many questions when someone doesn't come back from a wilderness trip. But you don't just let them disappear, do you?" Mark said. "You help them disappear." "I provide them with shelter and warmth in their final days," the man replied, his voice taking on an almost religious tone. "I give their lives meaning. I show them what it really means to be human when all the pretenses are stripped away." Mark realized he was dealing with someone who was completely detached from reality. This wasn't just a criminal, it was someone who had created an entire twisted philosophy around what he was doing. That made him much more dangerous and unpredictable. Behind him, Sarah was becoming more alert, though still very weak. She managed to whisper, "There are others. In the basement. He keeps them until..." "Until what?" Mark asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Until he decides it's their time," Sarah finished. The stranger nodded approvingly. "Sarah understands. She's learned quickly. Much faster than some of the others. That's why I've kept her around longer than usual. She has potential." Mark felt sick to his stomach. "There are other people here? Alive?" "For now," the man said. "Though the food situation is becoming critical. Which brings us back to our original problem, detective. This cabin isn't big enough for all of us." Suddenly, Mark heard something that gave him hope. Very faintly, through the sound of the wind, he could hear voices calling his name. The search and rescue team had found them. His radio transmission must have gotten through before the storm worsened. The stranger heard it too, and his demeanor immediately changed from confident to desperate. "That's unfortunate," he said, gripping the knife tighter. "I had hoped we could resolve this quietly among ourselves." Mark knew this was his chance. With rescue so close, he just had to keep everyone alive for a few more minutes. But he also knew that a cornered predator was at its most dangerous. "It's over," Mark said. "Put down the knife and surrender. There are too many people coming for you to fight them all." The man's eyes darted between Mark, Sarah, and the door. Mark could see him calculating his options, and none of them were good. That's when Mark made a crucial mistake. For just a moment, his attention was divided between the stranger and the approaching voices outside. In that instant of distraction, the man made his move. But, instead of attacking Mark directly, he lunged toward Sarah. Mark realized with horror that if he couldn't escape, the stranger intended to make sure that none of his victims would live to testify against him. The knife was heading straight for Sarah's heart, and Mark had only seconds to react. Mark didn't have time to think, only to react. He threw himself between the stranger and Sarah, taking the knife blade across his shoulder instead of letting it reach her heart. The pain was immediate and intense, but Mark managed to grab the man's wrist and force the knife away from both of them. The two men crashed into the cabin wall, fighting for control of the weapon. Mark was trained in hand-to-hand combat, but his opponent had the desperate strength of someone with nothing left to lose. They rolled across the floor, knocking over furniture and sending sparks flying from the fireplace. Sarah, despite her weakened condition, managed to crawl away from the fight and toward the door. She was calling out as loudly as she could manage, trying to guide the search team to their location. Her voice was weak, but it was enough to let the rescuers know they were getting close. The knife changed hands several times during the struggle. Mark managed to pin his opponent down for a moment, but the man used his knowledge of the cabin's layout to his advantage. He kicked over a wooden support beam that had been propping up part of the ceiling, sending a shower of debris down on both of them. In the chaos, Mark lost his grip on the knife, and it skittered across the floor toward the fireplace. Both men scrambled after it, but the stranger got there first. He grabbed the weapon and turned back toward Mark with wild eyes and blood running down his face from where he had been hit by falling debris. "You should have minded your own business, detective," the man snarled. "Now you're going to join the others in the basement." But before he could strike, the cabin door burst open and 3 members of the search and rescue team rushed in. They immediately assessed the situation and moved to surround the stranger. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he was still bleeding from the knife wound in his shoulder. "Drop the weapon," shouted the team leader, a mountain rescue specialist named Jake Morrison whom Mark had worked with before. "There's nowhere to run." The stranger looked around at the new arrivals and seemed to deflate slightly. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and he knew it. But, instead of surrendering, he did something that shocked everyone in the room. "If I can't have them," he said, looking directly at Sarah, "then no one can." He turned the knife on himself, driving it into his own chest before anyone could stop him. The man collapsed to the floor, blood spreading rapidly across his shirt. Jake immediately moved to provide first aid while another team member called for emergency medical evacuation. Mark knelt beside the dying stranger, hoping to get some final answers. "How many others are there?" he asked urgently. "Where are they?" The man's eyes were glazing over, but he managed to whisper, "Basement, hidden door, behind the shelves." Then, he was gone. Jake took charge of the scene while Mark and Sarah received medical attention. Despite his wound, Mark insisted on investigating the basement before the evidence could be contaminated. What they found there was worse than anyone had imagined. Behind a makeshift bookshelf, there was indeed a hidden door that led to a crude basement dug out of the earth beneath the cabin. In that dark, cold space, they found 3 people who were still alive, though barely. 2 hikers who had been missing for over a week, and a hunter who had vanished almost a month earlier. All 3 survivors were suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma. They had been kept prisoner in conditions that were barely adequate for survival. The hunter, a man named Tom Bradley, was in the worst shape. He had been there the longest and had witnessed things that would probably haunt him for the rest of his life. "He told us he was keeping us safe from the mountain," Tom whispered as the rescue team carried him out on a stretcher. "He said the storms would kill us if we tried to leave. But then, he would come down and he would choose one of us. Said it was to conserve food and resources. Said it was natural selection." Mark felt sick as he realized how close they had all come to becoming victims of this madman's twisted survival philosophy. If the search team had arrived even a few minutes later, Sarah might have been dead, and Mark himself might have joined the prisoners in the basement. As they searched the cabin more thoroughly, they found evidence of at least 8 other victims who hadn't been as lucky as the survivors. Driver's licenses, personal belongings, and, worst of all, a detailed journal that the stranger had kept describing his experiments in human survival and natural selection. The journal revealed that the man's name was Henry Kaplan, and that he had been a philosophy professor at a small college before his mental breakdown 3 years earlier. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude after losing his job and his family, but isolation had twisted his mind into something monstrous. Kaplan had convinced himself that modern civilization had made humans weak and that only through extreme adversity could people discover their true nature. He saw himself as a teacher, providing his students with the ultimate lesson about survival and the harsh realities of nature. Sarah was rushed to the hospital with severe hypothermia and dehydration, but doctors said she would make a full physical recovery. The psychological recovery would take much longer. She had spent 4 days believing she was going to die in that basement, listening to Kaplan's rambling lectures about survival and human nature. "He kept saying I was special," Sarah told Mark during one of his visits to her hospital room. "He said I had learned the lessons faster than the others, that I understood what he was trying to teach. I played along because I thought it would keep me alive longer, but inside I was screaming." The 3 other survivors also faced long roads to recovery. Tom Bradley required several surgeries to address health problems that had developed during his captivity. The two hikers, a couple from Denver named Mike and Lisa Peterson, struggled with severe post-traumatic stress and had to undergo intensive therapy. But, as horrific as the ordeal had been, Mark couldn't help but feel grateful for the strange series of events that had led him to that cabin. If he hadn't gotten separated from the search team, if he hadn't spotted the cabin through the storm, if he hadn't decided to investigate, all 4 survivors would probably have died in that basement. The case made national news, with headlines focusing on the mountain cabin of horrors and the wilderness professor who had turned survival into murder. But, for Mark, the story was much more personal. He had looked into the face of pure evil and had managed to save 4 innocent lives from a terrible fate. The investigation into Kaplan's activities continued for months. Search teams combed the surrounding wilderness looking for more evidence and more victims. They found several more burial sites and enough evidence to confirm that Kaplan had been responsible for at least 12 deaths over his 3 years in the mountains. Mark received a commendation for his actions, but he was more interested in the recovery of the survivors than in any recognition for himself. He stayed in touch with all 4 of them, checking on their progress and offering support whenever they needed it. The cabin itself was eventually demolished by the authorities, who wanted to eliminate any possibility that it could become a macabre tourist attraction. The site was left to return to nature, though it would be many years before the forest could fully reclaim the evil that had taken place there. 6 months after the rescue, Mark found himself back in the mountains, but this time under very different circumstances. Sarah Chen had organized a memorial hike for the victims who hadn't survived Henry Kaplan's twisted experiments, and she had asked Mark to join her. It was part of her healing process, she explained, to face the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. The group was small but meaningful. Along with Mark and Sarah, there were the 3 other survivors, Tom Bradley, Mike Peterson, and Lisa Peterson. Also joining them were family members of some of Kaplan's victims, people who needed to see where their loved ones had spent their final days and to say goodbye in their own way. The hike took them along the same trail that Sarah had been following when she got lost, but this time they were well prepared and accompanied by professional guides. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and mild temperatures that made the mountains seem welcoming rather than threatening. As they walked, Sarah shared more details about her ordeal that she hadn't been able to discuss immediately after the rescue. She talked about the mind games Kaplan had played, trying to convince his prisoners that he was saving them from a worse fate. He had shown them his journal filled with newspaper clippings about hikers who had died in the wilderness, claiming that he was offering them a chance at survival that others hadn't received. The worst part wasn't the physical conditions, Sarah explained as they reached a rest point with a view of the valley below. It was the way he tried to get inside your head. He would talk for hours about philosophy and human nature, trying to make you believe that what he was doing was somehow logical or even merciful. Tom Bradley nodded in understanding. He told me I was lucky to be chosen for his experiment. Said most people go their whole lives without ever discovering what they're really made of. I started to wonder if maybe he was right, if maybe this was somehow meant to happen. Mark listened to these revelations with a mixture of admiration and concern. He was amazed by the strength these people had shown in surviving such psychological torture, but he also worried about the long-term effects of their trauma. Each of them was dealing with survivor's guilt and the challenge of rebuilding their trust in other people. The memorial service itself was held at a beautiful meadow about a mile from where the cabin had stood. Families of the victims had brought photos and personal mementos to honor their lost loved ones. There were tears, but there was also a sense of closure and healing that Mark found deeply moving. One of the most powerful moments came when Tom Bradley spoke about his fellow prisoners who hadn't survived. He had been in the basement longer than anyone else and had witnessed Kaplan's selection process firsthand. His voice shook as he described people who had shown incredible courage and compassion even in their final moments. They took care of each other, Tom said. Even when they knew what was coming, they shared what little food and water we had. They told stories and jokes to keep our spirits up. They died as heroes, not victims. After the memorial, Mark had a chance to speak privately with each of the survivors about their ongoing recovery. Sarah had returned to her job as a software engineer but was also pursuing training as a search and rescue volunteer. She wanted to help other people who found themselves lost in the wilderness, turning her traumatic experience into something positive. Mike and Lisa Peterson had made the difficult decision to move away from Colorado. The mountains held too many painful memories for them, and they needed a fresh start somewhere that didn't constantly remind them of their ordeal. They had relocated to Florida and were slowly rebuilding their lives near the ocean. Tom Bradley had perhaps the most challenging road ahead. His extended captivity had left him with serious health problems and severe PTSD. He was working with a team of therapists and doctors, but his recovery would take years. Still, he maintained a positive outlook and credited his survival to the strength he had drawn from his fellow prisoners. Kaplan thought he was teaching us about human nature, Tom told Mark. But what I learned was the exact opposite of what he intended. I learned that people are fundamentally good, even in the worst circumstances. I learned that compassion and kindness are what make us human, not the ability to survive at any cost. As the group prepared to leave the mountains, Mark reflected on how the case had changed his own perspective on his work. He had always been dedicated to his job as a detective, but this experience had shown him the true impact that law enforcement could have on individual lives. He wasn't just solving crimes or catching criminals, he was literally saving people from unimaginable suffering. The case also led Mark to develop a new specialty in missing persons investigations. He began working closely with search and rescue teams across the state, improving communication and coordination between law enforcement and volunteer searchers. His experience in the cabin had taught him valuable lessons about survival and wilderness rescue that he could share with others. One of the most significant changes was the implementation of new safety protocols for solo searchers. Mark's decision to separate from the search team, while it had ultimately led to the rescue, was recognized as dangerous and potentially avoidable. New procedures were put in place to ensure that searchers always worked in pairs and maintained constant communication with base teams. The story of the mountain cabin also sparked important conversations about mental health resources in rural communities. Henry Kaplan's descent into madness might have been preventable if he had received proper psychological support after his initial breakdown. Mental health advocates used the case to push for better access to counseling and psychiatric services in isolated areas. Sarah's transformation from victim to advocate became an inspiration to other survivors of violent crimes. She began speaking at law enforcement conferences and victim support groups, sharing her story and emphasizing the importance of never giving up hope, even in the darkest circumstances. "People ask me how I stayed strong during those 4 days," Sarah would tell audiences. "The truth is, I didn't stay strong all the time. I had moments of complete despair when I thought I was going to die in that basement. But I also had moments when I remembered that there were people who loved me and who wouldn't stop looking for me. That knowledge kept me fighting." The investigation into Kaplan's activities eventually expanded beyond the immediate area where the cabin had been located. Law enforcement agencies across the western United States began reviewing unsolved missing persons cases from the past 3 years, looking for connections to Kaplan's movements before he settled in the Colorado mountains. Several additional victims were identified through this process, bringing the final death toll to 16 people. The scope of Kaplan's crimes was far broader than anyone had initially realized, spanning multiple states and including victims from various backgrounds and age groups. The only common factor was that they had all been vulnerable individuals who had found themselves alone in wilderness areas. Mark continued to be involved in the ongoing investigation, working with federal authorities to piece together Kaplan's movements and methods. What emerged was a picture of a methodical predator who had spent months studying potential hunting grounds and identifying locations where he could operate without detection. The case became a subject of study for criminal psychologists and law enforcement training programs. Kaplan's combination of intelligence, mental illness, and isolation had created a unique type of killer who operated outside the normal patterns that police were trained to recognize. His academic background and philosophical justifications for his crimes made him particularly difficult to understand and catch. But perhaps the most important legacy of the mountain cabin case was the reminder it provided about the value of human life and the importance of never giving up on missing persons cases. The fact that 4 people survived Kaplan's captivity was a testament to their strength and resilience, but also to the dedication of the search teams who refused to stop looking for them. Mark often thought about the chain of events that had led him to that cabin on that stormy night. If any single element had been different, if he hadn't joined the search, if he hadn't gotten separated from his team, if he hadn't seen the cabin through the snow, the outcome could have been tragically different. The experience taught him that sometimes the most important moments in life come from unexpected directions, and that the decision to help others, even when it puts yourself at risk, is what defines true heroism. Mark never considered himself a hero for what he did that night, but Sarah and the other survivors would always see him as the man who gave them back their lives and their futures. Years later, when Mark looked back on his career in law enforcement, he knew that no other case would ever compare to the night he found Sarah Chin in that mountain cabin and discovered the true meaning of courage in the face of evil.